who won the Democratic Delegate to Congress debate, from a concerned wife of the Virgin Islands. The 4 Democratic candidates seeking to become the Virgin Islands' next delegate to Congress met at the St. Croix Educational Complex for a debate that was informative and lively. Former Senator Emmett Hansen, former U.S. Attorney Delia Smith, Director of State Federal Relations and Washington Representative Teri Helenese, and former Senator Janelle Sarauw fielded questions on health care, WAPA, federal funding, disaster recovery, education, economic development, shipping costs, the rum cover-over, and the relationship between the delegate and the governor. The night revealed 4 very different candidacies. Sarauw presented herself as the prepared legislator who understands how Congress works. Helenese leaned heavily on her existing relationships in Washington and her knowledge of specific federal funding mechanisms. Hansen emphasized collaboration, experience, and plain-spoken advocacy. Smith relied on her legal background, leadership resume, and reputation for integrity. This analysis is based solely on their performance during this debate. It is not an endorsement or a prediction of who will win the election. To judge the debate fairly, I looked at 3 major categories commonly used to evaluate political debate performance: substance, rebuttal, and delivery. 1. Substance. On substance, Janelle Sarauw had the strongest overall performance. She consistently connected local problems to specific actions that a delegate could pursue through Congress, federal agencies, and congressional committees. Her strongest answers came on health care, disaster recovery, the South Shore of St. Croix, federal customs policy, and increasing the territory's influence in Washington. She proposed revisiting hospital reimbursement formulas, addressing the Medicaid cap, pursuing a disaster equity act, increasing the customs threshold, and building stronger alliances with the other territories, Alaska, Hawaii, and congressional caucuses. Sarauw also correctly separated the role of the delegate from the role of the governor. She said the delegate legislates and advocates, but does not administer the local government. Her proposal to meet regularly with commissioners and agency heads was designed to identify federal bottlenecks while leaving local administration to government house. Teri Helenese was a close second. She brought some of the most specific federal language of the night, repeatedly identifying Section 1108 of the Social Security Act as the source of the territory's Medicaid funding cap. She also discussed rebasing hospital reimbursements, establishing a feed mill on St. Croix, modernizing the postal system, and expanding the territory's distilled spirit industry. Helenese's weakness was repetition. Removing the Section 1108 cap is a major health care proposal, but she returned to it during several questions that were not primarily about Medicaid. Her platform appeared strongest in federal funding and intergovernmental relations, but less developed across the full range of issues. Delia Smith gave strong answers on disaster preparedness, federal oversight, and economic expansion. Her argument that the territory must improve its documentation before disasters so it can establish the value of damaged properties was practical. She also identified the judiciary, agriculture, and ways and means committees as priorities. However, several of Smith's answers focused more on her qualifications, relationships, and reputation than on the specific results she would pursue. When asked what would define a successful first term, she explained why her experience would help her build relationships, but did not clearly identify the legislation or measurable outcomes that would determine success. Emmett Hansen offered valuable points on collaboration, WAPA accountability, veterans, and expanding the rum cover-over to additional distilled spirits. However, some of his responses moved away from federal policy and into matters controlled primarily by the governor, legislature, or local agencies. His infrastructure answer, for example, focused heavily on public works, road maintenance, and local contracting rather than the federal actions he would pursue. Substance winner, Janelle Sarauw. 2. Rebuttal. Sarauw was also the strongest candidate in rebuttal. She listened closely to the other candidates and usually responded directly to their arguments. When Smith questioned whether Sarauw could accomplish her goals under Republican leadership, Sarauw pointed out that federal laws can be amended and that candidates cannot promote bipartisan relationships in one answer, and then suggest that working with Republicans is unrealistic in another. Her exchanges with Helenese over the rum cover-over were among the most substantive parts of the debate. Sarauw argued that making the $13.25 rate permanent should not prevent the territory from seeking a future increase. Helenese responded that the rate is established by Congress and was not something rum companies could privately renegotiate. Helenese performed well during those exchanges. She remained focused on her role in securing permanence for the cover-over and challenged Sarauw to explain how she would persuade Congress to raise the amount. She also directly disputed Smith's claim that the territory must first use existing Medicaid resources before seeking more, arguing that the funding is exhausted because the federal ceiling is inadequate. Smith's rebuttals were direct and often framed around accountability. She challenged the idea that every local problem is caused by insufficient federal funding and argued that the territory must properly manage what it already receives. She also contrasted her view of leadership with Sarauw, arguing that character, maturity, and respect for the law should be part of the decision voters make. Hansen generally avoided the confrontations. His calmer approach may have appealed to voters tired of political conflict, but it left him with fewer opportunities to challenge the other candidates' proposals. He declined to question another candidate during the candidate-to-candidate portion, saying he came to explain his own plans rather than participate in the direction the exchanges had taken. Rebuttal winner, Janelle Sarauw. 3. Delivery and credibility. Delia Smith narrowly had the strongest combined performance in delivery and credibility. Smith spoke with the seriousness and confidence expected from someone who has served as an assistant attorney general, assistant U.S. attorney, and U.S. attorney. Her opening statement clearly explained her path from secretary to attorney and federal prosecutor. She presented herself as someone who has already been vetted, confirmed, and trusted with a major federal leadership position. Her strongest delivery came when discussing preparedness, accountability, and the importance of character. Even when the exchanges became tense, Smith generally maintained a measured tone. Her decision to make character part of her closing argument may have divided the audience, but it was consistent with the leadership case she presented throughout the night. Her answer on birthright citizenship requires correction. She accurately recognized that the Supreme Court had recently upheld constitutional birthright citizenship in Trump v. Barbara, but she misstated the vote and applied the decision too broadly to the unresolved territorial question. That weakened an otherwise credible legal presentation. Sarauw had the strongest stage presence. She was energetic, confident, quick on her feet, and delivered the most memorable closing statement. Her argument that democracy sometimes requires confrontation effectively explained both her personality and the type of delegate she intends to be. However, credibility also depends on factual precision and clearly explaining the basis for major claims. Her statement that the Virgin Islands is the only American jurisdiction exempt from the Jones Act was inaccurate. Her claim that the territory had received $33 billion following Hurricanes Irma and Maria was also higher than the approximately $25 billion publicly reported by the Office of Disaster Recovery. Sarauw may have been counting additional relief efforts or funding outside the major programs tracked by ODR, but she did not explain how she reached the figure. These concerns did not erase her strong performance, but they prevented her from winning this category outright. Helenese sounded most credible when discussing her existing federal work, the Medicaid cap, and the rum cover-over. She also remained composed when challenged directly. Her delivery was weakened by the repeated use of the same talking points and by claims about funding that were not always explained in enough detail for voters to understand where the money came from or how it would be secured. Hansen was the most conversational and personally relatable candidate. His discussion of caring for elderly relatives and his family's military service gave his answers sincerity. However, his responses were sometimes meandering, and he occasionally moved away from the question. Delivery and credibility winner, Delia Smith. Fact-check concerns. Smith was partly correct on birthright citizenship, but she overstated what the Supreme Court decided. Smith said the Supreme Court had settled birthright citizenship in a 5-2 decision, and that anyone born under the American flag, including in the Virgin Islands, is constitutionally a citizen. She was likely referring to the Supreme Court's June 30, 2026 decision in Trump v. Barbara. The court held that children born in the United States to parents who are unlawfully or temporarily present are citizens under the 14th Amendment. However, the constitutional opinion had a 5-justice majority, while the overall judgment was 6-3 because Justice Brett Kavanaugh concurred on narrower grounds. It was not a 5-2 decision. More importantly, that case addressed the immigration status of parents. It did not expressly decide whether an unincorporated territory such as the Virgin Islands is constitutionally, in the United States, for purposes of the Citizenship Clause. People born in the Virgin Islands are unquestionably U.S. citizens at birth, but that citizenship is expressly granted through federal law, including 8 U.S.C. Section 1406. The Virgin Islands is not the only American jurisdiction exempt from the Jones Act. Sarauw said the Virgin Islands is the only American jurisdiction exempt from the Jones Act. The Virgin Islands does have a significant exemption from the federal coastwise shipping laws. However, federal law also lists American Samoa and the Northern Mariana Islands among the jurisdictions where those laws do not fully apply. Her broader economic argument remains relevant. The Virgin Islands exemption may create opportunities for maritime development and greater use of the South Shore. The statement became inaccurate because she described the territory as the only exempt American jurisdiction. $33 billion recovery figure was higher than the publicly available ODR total. Sarauw said the Virgin Islands had received $33 billion following Hurricanes Irma and Maria. She did not explain during the debate which programs or forms of assistance were included in that figure. The publicly available total from the Virgin Islands Office of Disaster Recovery is approximately $25 billion from the major federal recovery programs. ODR's 2026 reporting placed federal recovery investments at more than $24 billion. It is possible Sarauw was using a broader calculation that included other hurricane-related relief efforts, direct federal expenditures, loans, insurance payments, or funding outside the major programs tracked by ODR. Without a breakdown of her calculation, however, the $33 billion figure cannot be directly compared with or confirmed by the official ODR total available online. Saraw's larger point was valid. The Virgin Islands is managing an unprecedented amount of federal recovery assistance. However, the approximately $25 billion reported by ODR is the clearest publicly available official figure, while the basis for Saraw's $33 billion estimate remains unclear. Overall debate winner. Based on substance, rebuttal and delivery and credibility, Janelle Sarauw won the debate. This ranking is my assessment based on the 3 categories above, not an official debate result or scientific poll. Delia Smith had the strongest combined performance in delivery and credibility. Teri Helenese demonstrated strong knowledge of Medicaid, hospital reimbursement, and federal funding. Emmett Hansen offered the most collaborative and personally grounded presentation. but Sarauw had the best overall balance of policy knowledge, legislative understanding, and effectiveness during direct exchanges. Final ranking: 1. Janelle Sarauw, 2. Teri Helenese, 3. Delia Smith, 4. Emmett Hansen. The debate presented 4 different arguments for congressional leadership. Hansen argued collaboration. Smith argued experience, character, and credibility. Helenese argued federal relationships and funding expertise. Sarauw argued preparation, legislative knowledge, and forceful advocacy. In this debate, Saraw's command of the issues and ability to defend her positions carried the night. From a concerned wife of the Virgin Islands, subscribe to receive more updates on VI-related matters like these.